Alright, number 16. Assume both Italy and Greece produce only two goods, wine and olive oil. If Italy holds a comparative advantage in the production of wine, then which of the following statements is not true? So Italy holds a comparative advantage in wine, which necessarily means that Greece holds a comparative advantage in olive oil because the countries are said to only make two products. So in a situation like this, where one country has a comparative advantage in wine and the other has a comparative advantage in olive oil, then in this case Italy should focus on making wine, Greece should focus on making olive oil, and then they should gain more than they could do alone by trading. Okay, let's look at the choices. Italy must hold an absolute advantage in the production of wine. So let's just take a second to go over the definitions of absolute and comparative advantage. So an absolute advantage means that one country can produce goods less expensively than another country. In a comparative advantage, only the opportunity cost is lower. It's not an absolute value, it's just the opportunity cost of producing one good over another good. Alright, let's look at the choices. Italy must hold an absolute advantage in the production of wine. Now, just because you have a comparative advantage tells you nothing whatsoever about the absolute advantage. So that is not going to be a correct choice. Let's go on to B. And actually, we want the not correct choice. So since they want the not true, then that will actually be the answer. But let's just take a look at the other choices to make sure we're clear on everything. Greece holds a comparative advantage in the production of olive oil. So that's what we went over initially. If Italy has a comparative advantage in wine, then Greece has a comparative advantage in olive oil. So that one is true. And by true, it would not be the answer. Italy's opportunity cost of producing one additional unit of wine is lower than Greece's. And that's true, right? So they have a comparative advantage in wine because their opportunity cost, over here, the opportunity cost from the comparative advantage is lower. So that also is true. Maybe I'll put a T here. We'll put a T here. And Greece's opportunity cost of producing an additional unit of olive oil, where they have a comparative advantage, is lower than Italy's, and that one is true. And then finally, if trade is opened up between them, these countries have an incentive to trade, and that is absolutely true. Whenever two countries have a comparative advantage, they could gain by trading. Alright, number 17. Following a prolonged power outage, the price of flashlights normally increases significantly. If cities had passed laws prohibiting price increases for flashlights during power outages, such laws would most likely. So the framework we'll use for solving this problem is just to first look at our normal supply and demand curve. And then when there's a power outage and there's no lights, of course, the demand for flashlights is going to increase. So we see how we've increased the demand, moves out to the right. And then typically, if nothing changes, we see that there'll be a new price point out here going across, and a new quantity point out here. So in this case, where there's a blackout, the demand increases, you're going to have an increased output and you're going to have an increased price. But the government comes along and says, no, you cannot do that. They're going to say that the price cannot change, so they're putting a price ceiling that will look like that. And when you have a price ceiling, the price can no longer go above that, so that means that there's no reason for a supplier to increase the supply any more than where that price curve hits a supply curve, right? But the demand is still up here, right? So the demand is much higher. So what you're going to have is an even higher price, right? But the same quantity, right? And what you have in the situation is the quantity would have been here, but we're only going to be making this quantity, right? So you get into a situation where you have a shortage because of the price ceiling and higher prices than you normally would have had. Okay, so let's take a look at the choices. A, make flashlights more available. Well, we know that is not true. We just said we have a shortage in flashlights, so that one will not be true. Create a shortage of flashlights. Well, yeah, that's what we just said, so that is correct, but let's look at the other choices. It will shift the demand curve for flashlights to the right. Well, we did see the shift to the right. That's correct. But it's not the price ceiling that shifted it to the right. It's the blackout or the power outage which shifted to the right. So we have to be a little careful here to know why we're moving the demand curve to the right. It's from the outage, not from the price ceiling. So that would not be correct. Okay, and then shift the supply curve for flashlights to the left. And that certainly wouldn't happen. If anything, you'd think in the long run, if power outages were common, they would actually increase the supply, which would move it to the right. But that is not going to be correct. And finally, have no effect on the availability of flashlights, but we already said that there'll be a shortage, so that is not correct.